What if the gospel is not only about forgiveness? What if it is actually about becoming an entirely new person? For thousands of years, this message has transformed the lives of kings, prisoners, and ordinary people. But here is the mystery. Why does real change often begin in the quietest seasons of life? Why did David become a king only after years of obscurity? And why did Joseph rise to power only after slavery and prison? To understand this, we must discover what the gospel is truly meant to do inside the human heart. The gospel is not only about forgiveness. Many people believe that the gospel is simply about forgiveness. They think the message of Jesus is mainly about having our sins erased. And of course, forgiveness is a beautiful and essential part of the gospel. But the message of the gospel goes much deeper than that. It is not only about removing guilt. It is about transforming a person's life. The gospel is the story of how God changes human beings from the inside out. It is the story of how broken people can become new people, not just improved versions of themselves, but entirely renewed. To understand this, we must go back to the beginning. According to the Bible, humanity was created in the image of God. People were meant to live in harmony with their Creator. They were meant to reflect His character, His goodness, His wisdom, His love. But something went wrong. Humanity chose a different path. Instead of trusting God, people chose to trust themselves. Instead of following the Creator, they followed their own desires, and that decision changed everything. The relationship between God and humanity was broken, and something inside the human heart became deeply damaged. From that moment forward, human beings were no longer the same. We still carry the image of God, but that image became distorted. And because of that distortion, people began to struggle with things like pride, greed, jealousy, anger, and selfishness. Every society in history has tried to deal with these problems. Some cultures created laws, some created philosophies, others created moral systems. But no matter how many rules were created, the same problem continued to appear. Because the real problem was never only external behavior. The real problem was the human heart. And this is where the gospel begins to reveal its true power. The message of Jesus does not simply offer forgiveness, it offers transformation. It declares that God is able to give human beings a new heart, a new nature, a new way of living. This is why Jesus often spoke about being born again. For many people, that phrase can sound mysterious, but the idea behind it is actually very simple. Jesus was saying that following God is not just about improving your behavior, it is about receiving a new life. Just as physical birth brings a person into the world, spiritual rebirth brings a person into a new relationship with God. It changes the direction of their life, it changes the desires of their heart, and it changes the way they see the world. This transformation does not happen through human effort alone. It happens because God Himself begins to work inside a person. Slowly, quietly, but powerfully. Over time, the old patterns of life begin to fade, and new patterns begin to appear. Love where there was once anger, peace where there was once anxiety, humility where there was once pride. This is why the gospel is not simply a message about the past. It is a message about the future of a person's life. It is the promise that no matter how broken someone may feel, change is possible. Real change. Deep change. The kind of change that begins in the heart and eventually transforms everything else. But this leads us to another question. If the gospel truly has the power to change people from the inside out, why do so many people struggle to change themselves? Why is transformation so difficult for human beings? To understand that, we must take a closer look at the nature of the human heart. And this leads us to the next part of the story. Why humans cannot change themselves. So this leads us to an important question. If the gospel truly has the power to transform a person's life, why do so many people still struggle to change? Why is it that human beings often repeat the same mistakes again and again? Most people already know what is right. They know they should be kinder. They know they should forgive. They know they should avoid certain destructive habits. And yet, knowing what is right does not always lead to doing what is right. This is something every person experiences. A person might promise themselves, "Tomorrow I will be different. Tomorrow I will do better. Tomorrow I will change." But then tomorrow comes, and somehow the same patterns begin to appear again. The same struggles, the same reactions, the same habits. And after a while, people begin to wonder if real change is even possible. The reason for this is deeper than many people realize. The problem is not simply a lack of knowledge, and it is not simply a lack of discipline. The problem is much deeper than behavior. It lies within the human heart. Human beings often try to solve their problems by focusing on external actions. They create rules, they set goals, they develop systems to control behavior, and sometimes those methods can help for a short period of time, but eventually the deeper problem returns. Because rules cannot change the heart. A person can follow rules while still carrying anger, envy, pride, or bitterness inside. From the outside, everything may appear correct, but inside, the struggle remains. And this is why so many attempts at self-improvement eventually fail, because real transformation cannot happen through behavior alone. It requires something deeper. It requires a change in the heart itself. This is exactly what the message of the gospel addresses. The gospel does not simply say, "Try harder." It does not say, "Become a better person through your own effort." Instead, the gospel declares something far more powerful. It says that God Himself is able to transform the human heart, not just the outside of a person, but the very center of who they are. When this transformation begins, something remarkable happens. The things a person once desired begin to change. The things they once pursued begin to lose their power, and new desires begin to grow. A person who once lived only for themselves begins to care for others. A person once controlled by anger begins to discover peace. A person once driven by pride begins to learn humility. This transformation does not happen instantly, and it rarely happens in dramatic public moments. In fact, most of the time it begins quietly, slowly, deep within a person's heart, long before anyone else can see the result. This pattern appears again and again throughout the Bible. Before God raises a leader, before He fulfills a promise, before He reveals something extraordinary, He often begins with a hidden season of preparation, a season where transformation is happening quietly, a season where the outside world may not see anything special, but inside everything is changing. And some of the clearest examples of this pattern can be seen in the lives of two men, David and Joseph. Their stories reveal something profound. The greatest transformations often begin in the quietest moments of life, and that brings us to the next part of the story. When God begins His work quietly. When we read the stories of the Bible carefully, we begin to notice a surprising pattern. God's greatest works rarely begin in public. They rarely begin in places of fame. Instead, they often begin in hidden places, places where almost no one is watching. Before God places someone into a position of influence, He first prepares their heart. And that preparation can take years, sometimes many years. But those quiet seasons are never wasted, because in those moments God is shaping something deeper than skill. He is shaping character. And one of the clearest examples of this truth is found in the story of David. And that brings us to something very important. If real transformation comes from God, And if it begins deep within the human heart, then we should not be surprised that this transformation often begins quietly. Not in dramatic moments, not in front of large crowds, but in places where almost no one is watching. Throughout the Bible, we see this pattern again and again. Before God reveals something great in public, he first prepares a person in private. Before a promise is fulfilled, there is usually a season of preparation. And those seasons are often hidden. They can feel slow. Sometimes they feel confusing. Sometimes they even feel like nothing important is happening. But in reality, those quiet seasons are often the moments when God is doing his deepest work. Because transformation always begins within, long before it becomes visible to the outside world. Think about a tree for a moment. Before a tree grows tall above the ground, something important must happen below the surface. Its roots must grow deep. Those roots are invisible. No one sees them. No one celebrates them. But without those roots, the tree would never survive. In the same way, God often develops the roots of a person's life before he allows them to grow into something greater. And the Bible gives us many examples of this process. But two stories stand out more clearly than most: the story of David and the story of Joseph. Both of these men would eventually rise to positions of great influence. David would become one of the greatest kings in Israel. Joseph would become the second most powerful man in Egypt. But their journeys did not begin in places of honor. They began in places of obscurity, places where no one expected greatness, places where their character was quietly being shaped. Let us begin with the story of David. Before David was known as a warrior, before he was known as a king, before his name was remembered in history, he was simply a shepherd boy. David spent his days in the fields, watching over sheep, protecting them, guiding them. To many people, this kind of work would have seemed ordinary, perhaps even unimportant, but those years were not meaningless. In fact, those quiet years were preparing David for something far greater. Out in the fields, David learned courage. When wild animals attacked the flock, he defended them. When danger appeared, he did not run. He stood his ground. No crowds were watching. No songs were written about those moments. But every challenge was shaping the heart of a future king. And Chandra from. And during those long hours in the wilderness, David also learned something else. He learned to seek God. Many of the Psalms that people still read today were born in those quiet places, under open skies, among the hills and fields, in moments when David was alone with God. Those moments formed the foundation of his faith. Long before David sat on a throne, God was shaping the man he would become. And one day that hidden preparation would be revealed. But before we see how that happened, there is another story that reveals the same pattern. A story even more dramatic. The story of Joseph. The story of Joseph when the dream seems impossible. The story of Joseph. If David's story teaches us that God prepares people in quiet places, Joseph's story shows us that God can work even through the most difficult circumstances. Joseph was the son of Jacob. From a young age, Joseph's life seemed different. One night, Joseph had a dream. In that dream, he saw something remarkable. He saw that one day his family would bow before him. It was a strange dream, and it was a dream that would change everything. But Joseph was still young. He did not yet understand how complicated life could become. When he shared his dream with his brothers, they did not celebrate it. Instead, they became jealous. Deeply jealous. To them, Joseph's dream sounded like pride, and their jealousy began to grow into anger. Day by day, that anger became stronger. Until one day, everything exploded. One afternoon, Joseph's father sent him to check on his brothers who were working in the fields. When his brothers saw him coming from a distance, they made a terrible decision. At first, they talked about killing him, but eventually they chose something different. They sold him. Joseph was sold as a slave. Just like that, his life changed completely. The young man who once dreamed of greatness was now being taken far away from his home, far away from his family, into a foreign land, into Egypt. For many people, this moment would have felt like the end of the story. The dream was gone. The future seemed destroyed. Everything Joseph believed about his life appeared to be collapsing, but something important was still happening. Even in that painful moment, God had not abandoned Joseph. In fact, God was still guiding his story, even when Joseph could not see it. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to an Egyptian officer. His name was Potiphar. Joseph began working in Potiphar's household, and slowly, something interesting began to happen. Everything Joseph did began to succeed. Potiphar noticed this. He saw that Joseph was trustworthy, wise, responsible. Eventually, Potiphar placed Joseph in charge of his entire household. For a moment, it looked as if Joseph's life might finally be improving. But the story was not finished yet, because another trial was about to begin. One day, Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph. He had done nothing wrong, but the accusation was powerful enough. Joseph was arrested and thrown into prison. Once again, his life collapsed. From a favored son to a slave, from a trusted servant to a prisoner. And once again, Joseph found himself in a place he never expected, a dark prison, far from the dream he once believed in. For many people, this would have been a moment of despair, a moment to give up, a moment to believe that life had been unfair. But Joseph did something remarkable. Even in prison, he remained faithful. Even in prison, he continued to serve others. And slowly, the same pattern appeared again. Joseph gained trust. The prison warden noticed Joseph's character. Soon, Joseph was placed in charge of the other prisoners. Even in prison, Joseph's life began to influence others, because wherever Joseph went, his character went with him. Years passed. Joseph remained in prison. The dream must have seemed very far away, almost impossible. But one day everything changed. The Pharaoh of Egypt had a troubling dream. None of his advisors could explain it, but someone remembered Joseph. They remembered that Joseph had once explained dreams while he was in prison. Joseph was brought out before Pharaoh, and when Pharaoh explained the dream, Joseph understood its meaning. The dream was a warning. 7 years of abundance were coming to Egypt, but after that, 7 years of severe famine would follow. Joseph explained that Egypt must prepare. They must store food during the years of plenty, so that people could survive during the famine. Pharaoh listened carefully, and he realized something. Joseph was not only wise, Joseph was the right man to lead this preparation. And in a single moment, Joseph's life changed again. Joseph was released from prison. He was given authority over the entire land of Egypt. Only Pharaoh himself had greater power. The slave had become a ruler. The prisoner had become a leader. And the dream that once seemed impossible was finally beginning to come true. Years later, the famine spread across the region. Even Joseph's own family was affected. His brothers traveled to Egypt to buy food. They did not recognize him, but Joseph recognized them. In that moment, Joseph had a choice. He could seek revenge. He could punish the brothers who had betrayed him. But instead, Joseph chose something different. He chose forgiveness, and he spoke words that reveal one of the deepest truths in the entire Bible. He said, You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done. Those words reveal something powerful. Even the darkest moments of Joseph's life had not been meaningless. God had used every hardship, every delay, every trial to prepare Joseph for the role he would one day fulfill. And this brings us to an important realization. The path of transformation is rarely easy. Sometimes it includes waiting, sometimes it includes struggle, sometimes it includes seasons that feel confusing, but those seasons are not wasted. Because in those hidden moments, God may be preparing something far greater than we can currently see. What these stories reveal about transformation. When we step back and look at the stories of David and Joseph together, a clear pattern begins to appear. Both of them were chosen by God. Both of them received a promise, and both of them experienced a season where that promise seemed very far away. David was anointed as a king, but he returned to the fields. Joseph received a dream of leadership, but he was sold into slavery. From the outside, those moments look like failure. They look like delays. They look like detours that made no sense. But from God's perspective, something else was happening. Those seasons were not interruptions. They were preparation. This is one of the most important truths about spiritual transformation. God rarely changes a life in a single dramatic moment. Instead, he works slowly, quietly, patiently. He shapes the character of a person through experiences, through challenges, through seasons that test the heart. And over time, those experiences begin to shape something deeper. They shape the way a person thinks, the way they respond to difficulty, the way they treat other people, the way they trust God when life becomes uncertain. If David had become king the same day he was anointed, he might not have been ready. If Joseph had risen to power the same day he received his dream, his character might not have been strong enough. But the years of waiting, the years of struggle, the years of quiet preparation, formed something essential inside them, something that could not be created any other way. This is why the gospel is not only about forgiveness, it is about transformation. God does not simply remove the mistakes of the past. He begins shaping the future of a person's life. He begins forming a new heart, a new way of thinking, a new way of living, and often that transformation begins in seasons that feel ordinary or even difficult. Many people imagine that spiritual growth only happens in powerful moments, moments of worship, moments of prayer, moments of revelation. And those moments can certainly be important, but much of God's work happens in quieter places, in daily choices, in unseen struggles, in the slow process of learning to trust Him. Sometimes transformation begins when a person learns patience. Sometimes it begins when someone chooses forgiveness instead of bitterness. Sometimes it begins when a person refuses to give up hope. These moments may seem small, but over time they shape the direction of an entire life. And this brings us to something deeply personal. Because the stories of David and Joseph are not only ancient stories, they are mirrors. They reveal something about the journey that many people experience today. There are seasons in life when everything seems clear, but there are also seasons when life feels uncertain. Seasons when progress seems slow. Seasons when the future feels hidden. And in those moments, people often ask a very important question. Is anything meaningful actually happening, or am I simply waiting? The Bible suggests a surprising answer. Even in those quiet seasons, even in those confusing moments, God may be doing His most important work, not on the outside, but within the heart, preparing something that will only become visible later, much later, and this raises an even deeper question. If transformation often begins quietly, and if God uses seasons of waiting to shape a person's life, then how should we respond during those seasons? What does it mean to remain faithful when the outcome is still unclear? That is exactly what we will explore next. The purpose of waiting seasons. So the question becomes very personal. If God often works through seasons of waiting, how should we understand those seasons? Why does transformation so often include time? Why do so many stories in the Bible include long periods where nothing seems to be happening? At first glance, waiting can feel frustrating. Human beings naturally want progress. We want answers. We want to see movement. We want to see results. But waiting is rarely comfortable. It can feel slow, uncertain, sometimes even discouraging. Yet, throughout the Bible, waiting is not presented as wasted time. Instead, waiting often becomes the place where faith grows. Think again about the stories we have already seen. David waited years between the moment he was anointed and the moment he became king. Joseph waited years between the dream he received and the day that dream was fulfilled. And these stories are not unique. Abraham waited decades for the promise of a son. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading Israel. Even the ministry of Jesus began after many quiet years that are barely recorded. This pattern appears again and again. God often prepares people before he positions them. And that preparation takes time. But why does it take time? Why doesn't transformation happen instantly? One reason is that character cannot be rushed. Skills can sometimes be learned quickly. Information can be gained in a short moment. But character develops slowly. It is formed through experience, through choices, through moments when a person must decide whether to act with integrity or to take the easier path. Waiting seasons often bring those moments. Moments when faith is tested. Moments when patience is required. Moments when a person must continue forward even when the outcome is unclear. And each of those moments shapes something inside the heart. Waiting also reveals what truly matters to us. When life moves quickly and everything goes well, it is easy to believe our faith is strong. But when progress slows, when answers do not come immediately, when circumstances become difficult, our deeper motivations begin to surface. Do we still trust God when life feels uncertain? Do we still believe that our story has meaning, even when the path is unclear? These are the kinds of questions that waiting seasons reveal. And through those questions, faith becomes deeper, more real, more resilient. There is another purpose hidden inside waiting. Waiting teaches humility. When life moves according to our own plans, it is easy to believe we are in control. But waiting reminds us that life is larger than our personal timeline. It reminds us that some things cannot be forced. Some things must unfold at the right time, and learning to accept that truth can transform the way we live. Instead of trying to control everything, a person begins to trust that God's timing may be wiser than their own. In many ways, waiting becomes a quiet classroom, a place where the heart learns lessons that cannot be learned any other way. Patience, trust, perseverance, compassion for others who are also struggling. These qualities do not grow instantly. They grow gradually, often in the background, often in moments that seem ordinary, but over time, they reshape who a person becomes. And this is why the gospel speaks about transformation as a journey that unfolds step by step, day by day, moment by moment, sometimes through joy, sometimes through difficulty, but always moving toward something greater, toward a life that reflects the character of God more clearly. Yet there is still another question to ask. If God uses time to shape the human heart, what exactly changes inside a person? How does this transformation actually happen? How does a heart that once struggled with pride learn humility? How does a life once driven by fear learn peace? Understanding that process may be one of the most important parts of the entire journey, and that is what we will explore next. How God changes the human heart over time. So how does this transformation actually take place? If God truly changes people from the inside out, what does that process look like? The Bible suggests that transformation rarely happens through a single moment. Instead, it unfolds gradually, step by step, like the slow turning of a compass. At first, the direction changes almost invisibly, but over time, the entire path of a life begins to shift. One of the first things that begins to change is the way a person sees themselves. Before transformation begins, many people live with a constant need to prove themselves, to appear strong, to appear successful, to appear in control. But as God works within the heart, something different begins to happen. A person begins to understand their own limitations. They begin to recognize their weaknesses, not with shame, but with honesty. And strangely, this honesty often becomes the beginning of freedom. Because once a person no longer needs to pretend to be perfect, they can finally begin to grow. Another change begins to happen in the way a person sees others. Before transformation, people often measure others through comparison. Who is more successful? Who is more respected? Who has more influence? These comparisons quietly shape the way people treat one another. But when the heart begins to change, comparison slowly loses its power. Instead of competition, compassion begins to grow. Instead of jealousy, gratitude begins to appear. A person begins to see others not as rivals, but as fellow travelers on the same journey, and that shift alone can transform relationships. Transformation also begins to change how a person responds to difficulty. Earlier in life, struggles often produce frustration, or anger, or discouragement. But as the heart grows, a different response begins to emerge, not because problems disappear, but because perspective changes. A person begins to see that even difficult seasons can carry meaning. Even challenges can shape something valuable. This does not make suffering easy, but it does make suffering purposeful, and purpose changes the way we endure hardship. Another sign of transformation is the growth of patience. Earlier in life, many people want immediate results, immediate success, immediate answers. But as faith deepens, patience becomes possible. Not passive patience, but active trust. The kind of trust that believes something meaningful is unfolding, even when the full picture is not yet visible. This kind of patience is what allowed David to wait years before becoming king. It is what allowed Joseph to remain faithful even in prison, and it is what allows people today to continue forward through uncertain seasons. Over time, these changes begin to reshape an entire life. The direction of a person's choices begins to shift. Their priorities change. What once seemed important may lose its urgency, and what once seemed small may become deeply meaningful. Moments of kindness, moments of honesty, moments of quiet faithfulness. These moments may never appear in headlines, but they gradually form a life of integrity. A life that reflects something greater than personal success. A life that reflects the character of God. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this transformation is that it never truly stops. The journey of growth continues throughout life. Each season teaches something new. Each challenge reveals something deeper. Each experience shapes the heart further. Until one day when we look back, we begin to see something remarkable. The person we once were is not the person we have become. The fears that once controlled us no longer have the same power. The habits that once defined us no longer shape our identity. Something real has changed, not just on the outside, but within. And this brings us to the final question. If transformation can reshape an entire life, if God can use waiting seasons to prepare the heart, And if even the hardest moments can carry meaning, then what does this mean for us today? What does it mean for someone who is still in the middle of the journey? That is the question we will explore in the final part of this story, the quiet work that changes everything. So what does all of this mean for us today? What are the stories of David and Joseph, the seasons of waiting, and the slow transformation of the human heart? Tell us about our own lives. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: the most meaningful changes in life often begin quietly. Not in dramatic moments, not in moments when the world is watching, but in the quiet places of the heart. Many people spend their lives waiting for something big to happen, a breakthrough, a clear sign, a moment when everything suddenly makes sense. But transformation rarely arrives that way. Instead, it grows slowly, through small decisions, through daily faithfulness, through moments when a person chooses patience instead of frustration, kindness instead of anger, faith instead of fear. These moments may seem small, but over time, they shape the direction of an entire life. When David was watching sheep in the fields, he probably did not realize that those quiet days were preparing him to lead a nation. When Joseph was sitting in a prison cell, he probably did not imagine that those years were leading him toward a position that would save thousands of lives. Yet, that is exactly what happened. Because God was working even when the path seemed unclear, and the same pattern can still appear today. There are seasons when life feels slow, seasons when progress seems invisible, seasons when people wonder whether anything meaningful is happening at all. But those seasons may carry more purpose than we realize, because sometimes while we're waiting for life to change, God is quietly changing us. He shapes patience where there was once impatience. He grows humility where there was once pride. He forms courage where there was once fear. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of life begins to emerge. A life not driven by comparison, not controlled by anxiety, but guided by trust. When that kind of transformation takes place, success begins to look different. It is no longer defined only by power or recognition. Instead, success becomes something deeper, a life that reflects truth, a life that reflects love, a life that reflects the character of God. And perhaps that is the true message of the gospel. Not only forgiveness, not only a second chance, but the possibility of becoming someone new, a person whose heart has been reshaped, a person whose life begins to carry meaning far beyond personal ambition. So if you find yourself today in a quiet season, a waiting season, or even a difficult season, do not assume that nothing is happening. The roots of transformation often grow underground, long before the tree rises above the surface, and when the time comes, the change that once seemed invisible can suddenly become clear. Because the quiet work God begins in the heart has the power to change an entire life. Before you leave, I want to ask you something. Which part of this story speaks the most to your life right now? Are you in a season like David where God is preparing you quietly? Or a season like Joseph where the journey feels difficult, but the purpose is still unfolding? Write your answer in the comments. Your story might encourage someone else who is walking through the same season.